So we're getting into day three of the Biden presidency. I've just watched two videos on CNN via YouTube. They're quite short, so they're watchable, less than 5 minutes each. And I think they just reiterate, the subject matter, not necessarily the angle that CNN takes, but the subject matter reiterates what I was saying in my previous two companion videos, the one on Trump's legacy and the one on what lies ahead for Biden. Regarding Trump's legacy, I've always said that usually the passage of time is the fairest way to look at to assess a leader's legacy, whether presidents or prime ministers. Um, but in the case of Trump, it would be very hard pushed to even allow, say, 20 years. That still won't change the fact that this was a president who was impeached twice. Something like that isn't something that will kind of change the record over time. Something like a foreign policy is a bit more requiring of historic judgment, because foreign policy can take time to really for us to really see the effects. Um, there are, of course, examples in history where presidents who were ranked very low are now held in higher regard. Ulysses S. Grant is one example. Incidentally, I've got Grant's famous journals from the Civil War, so that will make for an interesting read. So when Grant left the White House, he had extremely low approval ratings, and for a long time afterwards, well into the 20th century, he was seen as one of the worst presidents because of the corruption of his administration. However, reassessments more recently have been a bit more favourable to Grant, and he now ranks around the middle of presidents, maybe still on the lower quartile, but certainly better. And they cite, for example, his efforts to protect black rights in the Reconstruction era. Um, there are other examples, of course. Harry Truman had extremely low approval ratings when he left. He's now ranked in the top 15 presidents, top 20 at least. So it is something that can change over time. George W. Bush is another example. When Bush left, there was a lot of talk about Bush being the worst president. I never really thought he was. He's certainly one of the most controversial presidents. But Bush, this is Bush 43, now tends to gravitate around the lower sort of quartile, not the very bottom, but somewhere around the middle, a little bit on the lower side of the middle. But, anyway, this isn't for presidential assessments. I want to talk about the two videos that I watched. So the first one, the CNN reporter was interviewing some anarchists in Portland, Oregon. And that's the word I use because I really do think it is the best way to describe them. The first guy honestly sounded high. He had some sort of mask on. His words were kind of drawled. He sounded genuinely like he was high. The second person was a young woman. She didn't have any covering. Um, and she came out with a lot of babble about how she had no right to judge rioters. She said she doesn't involve herself in vandalism herself, but as she saw it, the Democrats and Republicans are two sides of the same coin, and we need a forest, or two branches of the same tree, and we need a forest. That would be all very well and poetic if it wasn't for the fact she was openly condoning vandalism. She said she doesn't do it herself, but she's not going to condemn it. Now, um, these people are anarchists because they don't believe in order. They don't believe in any sort of order is probably the wrong word to use, but they take, for example, a position of wanting to defund the police. There's an inherent hypocrisy there because the very same people will then decry the police if they don't respond to, say, a group of white supremacists or right wing militia types who threaten lives or put minorities perhaps at risk. Then they would be screaming for the police. But defunding the police is an absolutely anarchist position because even mainstream Democrats and mainstream left wingers have said that would be a very stupid idea. I mean, they kind of remind me of the Red Guards in China's Cultural Revolution. They just believe in destruction. They don't. They talk about wanting justice in society, racial justice and gender justice and all the rest of it. But what are they actually doing to make things better, except rioting and vandalism? So, as far as I'm concerned, they're part of the problem, not the solution. And they're absolutely endorsed in their own notion of self-righteousness. I think dealing with someone like that, there's no way to talk to someone like that, really. Now, the next video, CNN person went into a county in Texas, which is real red county, real Trump country, and he asked the question, would they be willing to give President Biden a chance? Now, I think there was about five respondents, and four of them said yes, they would, and he has the potential to be a good president. But as one of them put it, he needs to be less divisive. Of course, there's an irony in that they supported a man who was extremely divisive, a flamethrower in chief. But this is why looking at those two videos just shows how big a challenge Biden is going to have, and how deep a challenge it is going to be to try and mend America's culture wars. Because on one hand, you have left-wing anarchist rioters who are 100% convinced that they're justified. She claimed that the woman I was talking about claimed that vandalism is a long part of the American or protesting tradition, like the Boston Tea Party, a very different time and context. But that's just, she fails to understand that when rioters trash businesses, and these aren't big multinationals, these are just local shops. Um, all it's doing is hurting that community. It's not having some sort of swipe at police brutality or corrupt politicians or anything else. It's just causing destruction. In my country, we see echoes of this as well. I see it from the far left when they condone violence as it's from their side. Because this is the problem. Both sides are so dogmatic. Just as it was Trump voters trying to downplay the insurrection and claim it wasn't really Trump voters. Um, they also had an interview with a guy who believed in QAnon. You may have seen it, where he was interviewed before and after, and he didn't have the humility to just admit that he was wrong. He said he needed to reassess his life, and he still believes that it was a steal and so on, even though he said he was convinced that Biden would not be taking the oath of office. Um, so I think that it's a real challenge. What I want to see is American moderates on left and right being more vocal, letting their feelings be heard. Those Trump voters seem to me to be somewhat reasonable. I probably wouldn't agree with a lot of their politics, but at least they were saying they would give him a chance. Now, on the comment section, bearing in mind this is CNN, I saw lots of comments like, oh, they're idiots, they're blah, blah, blah. But I'm thinking, well, what about your side? Do you have the same judgment about those people who protested when Trump was inaugurated 4 years ago? They didn't give Trump a chance. Now, Trump was a terrible president, but that's not the point. The point is about values and double standards here. And some people might say, why am I so interested? I'm an outsider. But like I say, these sort of situations echo back in this country as well. So it does involve the UK in the sense that it's of interest because these sort of things go on in our society as well. Um, but I have no time for dogmatics on either side. Um, because if you have someone who is self-described Antifa, their whole logic is they're fighting against evil, right? So you cannot convince a person like that rioting, wearing black overalls and attacking the police and throwing Molotov cocktails is wrong, because they have convinced themselves that they're crusaders for righteousness. They see themselves as in the same league as those who fought the Third Reich, except that they're not. They are is criminals and anarchists. They're not soldiers who stormed the beaches at Normandy. They're not the brave young RAF men. who risked their lives at 20,000 feet. They were actual anti-fascists as far as I'm concerned. Um, and as for the Trump people, decrying those insurrectionists who decried the steal, and they were moaning about their voice being taken away, yet they were trying to trample the voices of 80 million people who won the election. So it's the problems are deeply embedded. I think in a country of 330 million people, you're always going to have extremists. It would be impossible to totally evade that. But I think one thing Biden must do is, if there is further unrest, and there probably will be, he needs to show that he is capable of being truly being a leader for all Americans. He said he will. So now he needs to prove it. He needs to condemn left wing rioters just as vocally as he condemned the insurrectionists on Capitol Hill. Um, Same with Harris. They both need to do it. Because it's all very well condemning the other side. That's easy to do. But the true test of leadership is calling out the extremes in your own midst. I believe that's the true test of leadership. Um, and yeah, that's what he has to do. It's going to be a challenge. I was going to say something else. I think I've covered it. Yeah. Um, if you're in the United States, if you're American, I really, really do wish the best for your country, because I think that when America's stable, that's good for the West and the world. I really do. Right now, it's a grim situation. But Biden, for example, can help by saying, to me, a leadership position would be that we recognize there are problems of police brutality that must be tackled, police accountability that must be tackled. But defunding the police is absolutely counterproductive. That would be the sort of position of leadership that I would want to see, whereby he is sticking true to the principles of his party, but is also recognizing that the extremes will not work. I'm not saying these anarchists were Biden supporters. One thing about Joe Biden, he doesn't have anywhere near the level of personal support that Trump has. I mean, millions of people voted for him because they thought he would be a much better president. Maybe they genuinely supported him. But Biden doesn't have anywhere near a cult following in the same way. On the Democratic side, it's Bernie Sanders, and of course, there's these memes going around which are amusing. I wonder what Bernie himself thinks of that. I don't know. It's kind of to be a serious presidential candidate to be an internet meme, but some of them are quite creative. That's for sure. Okay, I'll leave it there. But this is what Biden and every serious person needs to do. They need to call out the extremes, and they need to recognize that mindless destruction will not change a damn thing. It just won't. I do think also, oh yeah, I remember what I was going to say now. It's about CNN. Again, they have not learned. They are, how do they frame the story? We speak to protesters. Now, if that was Trump people, they would be saying rioters. What's the difference? Both use violence, both smash up windows, both are totally incapable of any sort of reasonable conduct. So what's the difference? CNN calls them protesters and not rioters. And, CNN itself needs to take some responsibility for its lack of consistency and its blatant double standards. I don't believe they will, but there is something incidentally called I think it's the Federal Regulation Authority, which does actually, it's the independent regulator of American media. I'd long, I was unsure about that. I don't know how much part it has. Like, for example, if it's comparable to Ofcom in the UK or what. I know it's got a long history from the 1930s onwards. But anyway, CNN needs some introspection itself. I don't think they will. I think they're arrogant, and I think that they fail to recognize their style of reporting, calling one rioter a protester, calling another rioter a rioter or an insurrectionist or a domestic terrorist. People see those double standards, and it causes more division.